Welcome to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum and our new show, Alexander Calder in Context. Hello, my name is Angela Yonke, and I'm a guest curator here at the Guggenheim. I've been fascinated by Alexander Calder's work ever since viewing it as a child. Did you know that from 1964 to 65, the Guggenheim actually hosted Calder's retrospectives? It opened with immense success and public support to critical acclaim. Calder was one of the youngest artists to have their retrospective when this show went up. A little over half a century later, Calder's influence and appeal can still be felt today in 2020. During this pandemic, we are excited to showcase this exhibit in digital form for our viewers at home, and I will be wearing a microphone to ensure clarity for our hearing impaired listeners. You will notice the changing scenery behind me as we move through the show, indicating different floors of the museum we will be covering. Now let me tell you a little bit more about this show. Come on, let's go. The Guggenheim is a fitting environment for the work of Alexander Calder. The spiral, organic, curvilinear shape of the building itself mirrors many of the celestial forms Calder's work deals with. Architect Frank Lloyd Wright and Calder share a love of modernist design, which emphasizes simplicity and form. Wright's belief that geometry has cosmic meaning and could create harmony between individuals and the universe was quoted in Anthony Alphonsen's book, The Lost Years, 1910 to 1922. Calder's preoccupation with cosmic bodies and their movements fit perfectly into Wright's celestial setting. Movement, which is thematically present in all of Calder's work, is also an integral design feature to the architecture of the Guggenheim. Wright planned on visitors to enter the building and immediately take the elevator right to the top before winding their way down through the exhibits. The gallery space loops 1/4 of a mile continuously downward, an unending centripetal movement of bodies interacting with the space sets up our Calder story very nicely. Each floor flows freely into one another, while a central atrium, which we are standing beneath right now, bathes viewers in natural light. Calder's use of wind to power many of his mobiles and Wright's desire to let nature into his buildings feels like an organic pairing in this respect. At each level, a seating area will also have Calder art books out for patrons to pause, reflect, and read. Please follow me to the elevator so we can go to the top floor and start this show. All right, welcome to the top floor of the Guggenheim. Let's start the show. Now that we're away from my bosses downstairs, we can drop the flight attendant fake personality, which is pretty annoying. Let's go to our first artworks. Here are our first quotes, kind of setting up our foundation for Calder. Both his grandfather on the left and his father on the right were both famous sculptors, and it's important to note that both of them were figurative sculptors. They used representation, which was the dominant style of the times, and they were very successful. Because of this family influence, Calder was really around an art community at an early age. He got to meet a lot of artists as a child, and he knew the process and went into the studio quite a bit. He also knew the lifestyle. He traveled around with his family and his father as he worked from project to project. Even when his father was in Europe, when he was older, Calder would use his studio as well as a working space. Also important to note is that both of these representational artists are something that he rebelled against. All right, so he was always being compared to them. They were pretty famous. He was kind of expected to do something else. His family didn't really want him to become an artist, so he went into engineering. He did study at Stevens Institute of Technology. He got an engineering degree, but he did find his way to art, as we all know now today. On the left, Alexander Mills Calder's statue. This is a portrait, an emblematic portrait. It's in bronze. It is of Major General George Gordon Meade. And this is a famous Civil War general. He is famous for defeating General Lee in the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. It's an equestrian statue, and this sits in Philadelphia. There was a campaign after the Civil War by the Women's Auxiliary Committee for Meade to finance this memorial. And this is sort of in a larger tradition of the South not really accepting the outcome of the Civil War and trying to paint it in a better light. They were really trying to rewrite history, and it was this lost cause of the Civil War that it was painting it in more of a heroic, monumental light than had really been the actual outcome. Our portrait on the left is a statue of Washington. It is by Alexander Sterling Calder, and this is also an emblematic portrait. It's using symbols of morality and justice. You see the scales in the background. It's also making reference to Roman sculpture, Roman orator. See how he's leaning there on the column? That is an emblematic or symbolic stance that it is taking. And this is the style that Alexander Calder, the grandson, was indoctrinated into, and something that he decidedly came to decide that he did not want to follow in that tradition. Another characteristic of this emblematic portrait is that you can tell that these are not set in contemporary scenery. George Washington by this point has been dead for quite a while, and we see him with sort of some Greek and Roman-esque imagery and people. You can see their toga dress, that this is characteristic of emblematic portraits. And it is symbolizing strength of Washington. It's also symbolizing the unity that he's creating between the two different sides, and that's why they have two different figures. All right, moving along, we have another sculpture, a bronze sculpture by Alexander Sterling Calder. It is a picture of actually his son, and Calder posed for this. So he was always being really compared to his dad, who was highly figurative. He was in the realism movement of art, and he rebelled against this later on. Paskin, those quotes, one of the quotes that you just read, Paskin is actually a friend of his father, and he meets Alexander Calder in France and helps him to get shows. He also helps him write an exhibition introduction for his catalog for one of his first shows. Abstract art is what Calder really settles on. It comes later, and he would return to biomorphic forms later in life, like this fish, glass fish here on the right. But they were still abstracted. They were not completely realistic. They were more taking liberties with organic forms. This other quote here is from is referencing his father, how Alexander as a child would always pick up bits of glass and rock and stone and put them in his pockets. And he was sort of a kind of junk collector of sorts. And this is reflected in his portrait here as well. You see that there is a continuous line. You start to see, here's a prime example of how line is a primary emphasis in a lot of his works, as well as humor. It is a continuous line you can see, and an assemblage of found objects found around Alexander's studio in Rothbury in New York. It is a mobile, it does move, and it is hanging. All right, here are two early examples of Alexander Calder's work. They're both from the Art Students League when he was going to this institution. His dad did teach there, and there were other artists that he admired who taught there, and that's the reason why he went there. It was a modern school, though. It allowed women to participate. It did have new drawing. It did not have a degree system, so it was open to everyone, and it was sort of in substitution of this grand tour. And in that quote, it's like referencing a grand tour of New York City and the older ladies who've saved up all their money to come and go to the Artist Students League. But it was a mixture of figuration and abstract art education. It was non-academic, though. Within this Art Students League, there was a school of thought, the Ashcan School. So they promoted everyday life, sketching outdoors as subject matter. Alexander Calder during this time period took the trains all day and did a lot of sketching on the trains. He wandered around the city and saw it under construction. This was a time when New York was building skyscrapers and cityscapes. The skyline was really changing. The Ashcan School was also considered the American version of Impressionism. It really did have a lot to do with the effects of different light. And you notice in this quote here, Alexander is kind of complimenting himself on the picture on the right, Old Madison Square Garden, that he's getting really good at painting this artificial light. It was the American version of Impressionism, but it was a lot of the time showing a little bit dirtier versions of the city, especially at night. It did have a journalistic approach to the urban scene as well. And you can see the construction and night scenes are really vibrating. They are vibrant and it has a lot of vitality, that kind of feeling. It's in constant motion, even at night, but also in the daytime with this construction site. This is from those, it's kind of a bustling feeling that you get at New York during this time. It really reflected it in the art. Immigrants are coming in trying to find a new life. Their tenements are bursting full, and it's reflecting in the painting and drawing. It's the city undergoing a lot of change, and it's a struggle for many. The pace of life is speeding up, and with new technology, there are a lot of people coming to New York City and moving around the city. Okay, so here we have an early artwork from Calder. It's a self-portrait painting. And you have two other paintings by John Sloan and Guy Penet Dubois. Those are both two of his teachers. They are at the Art Students League, and this is a kind of continuation of Ashcan School philosophy. It's everyday life, it's the effects of life on urban life, it's mixing of social classes, which you would find at the bar or on the street scenes. And you start to see the influence of abstract in Calder's work. You see that his face isn't fully defined. He's using broader areas of color, very similar to what Sloan and Dubois are doing, especially Dubois. He is saying in the quote that the girls look like wood carvings, that they have simplicity of form, shape, without detail. They are more abstract. And he's referencing toys, which is also his interest during this time in his early career as well. For Sloan, he's kind of referencing making his own type of art and getting away from the kind of art that his family makes. You can see that Alexander Sterling Calder and Milne Calder would never make a artwork like this. It's too simplistic, it's too rough. The process to paint that Dubois took as well was painting everything all black first and adding colors later. This is a hint to Calder's feature palette, where he uses a lot of black and white as the main color and only colors in a lot of his artwork. He also references Dubois' solidity in quotes. And this references Calder's use of masses and volumes and space in later art. You have this feeling of weight in his works. All right, here we have another teacher at the Art Students League. This wasn't actually one of Calder's main teachers, but he did sit in on a couple of the sessions. And despite that, Thomas Hart Benton's writing and philosophy about composition is pretty well known during this time period. He did paint this in 1919. This is Calder's attempt at abstraction. And even though Thomas Hart Benton kind of hated the abstract art, he did have some strong ideas that Alexander Calder shared about composition, about form, about balance. So I'm including that in a major part of his influences. So Thomas Hart Benton, he was a theory maker of his times. He was a realist. He didn't get into abstraction. He kind of reacted against it, especially with the Armory show. Okay? But this love of no-tan, of dark and light, and how it has a formal relationship with each other was a really big part of his theory. He's also really talking about the dynamic quality that you can have of lines, and you can see that in Alexander Calder's jewelry here and in the framed picture. The diagonals, the swoops, it has a lot of movement and flow. That is something that Thomas Hart Benton would have liked. You see that quality in his line drawings, in the single lines that are continuous of his circus drawings. You see it in his mobiles. It is a moving factor in the scene. He's very interested in not having a lot of parallel lines, which even in his own artwork, he does have some parallel lines. They are helping frame the picture a little bit. But when you're talking about Thomas Hart Benton, he's really working in 2 dimensions, and Alexander Calder is working in 3 dimensions. So you can't have parallel lines to the frame if you're working in 3D because there is no frame. You're working in real life, in the real world. You're working into space. So there's a little bit of a difference there for sure. Alexander Calder, while he was at the Art Students League, did take a job at the National Police Gazette. This was a satirical and political magazine that some of the other students worked at. It follows along the Ashcan School, which had a journalistic approach. So Calder was an illustrator, and he was assigned at one point to cover the Barnum and Bailey Circus. And he was really fascinated with this. It was very exciting to him, and his humorous personality really took a liking to this assignment. He went several times, made drawings, sketches, paintings, and later he did gouache paintings and wire sculptures of these works, of these scenes. The drawings became lines in the air with wire, these sculptures, and you see a lot of movement. You see this single line, it's capturing the essence of the scene, and these works were really when his imagery started to become a lot more graphic. By very nature of being in a publication, you have to make it easily reproducible by the printing press, right? The circus was also a place that the Ashcan School would have liked because this is where mixing of classes happened. The elites were next to the working class. Intellectuals were right sitting next to artists. And Ashcan's journalistic approach to the urban scene was very fitting. It was a progressive stance on social ethos. All right, next we have a quote from Alexander Calder regarding his extremely pivotal, influential, I would say monumental meeting of Piet Mondrian. He went to visit his studio and it was life-changing, he said. It was like being like a baby being slapped, he said. This is where he was really introduced to what abstract art was. He had heard the term abstract and he knew what modernism was, but he hadn't really seen it in real life. And Piet Mondrian's studio was the personification of abstract art. You can see it in the decoration, you can see it in the furniture. This is a recreation on the left, but you have an actual painting of his on the right. This is where Alexander Calder decided to abandon representation for the most part. He started using a limited color palette similar to Mondrian's. He focused primarily on form, on line, on mass, on movement only. So you really start to see no figures, no animals. It is all about the design, all about the formal elements. Painting, he transferred this into painting, and while he tried this out for a little while, he really shifted over into sculpture. He was doing these wire portraits, and he wanted to work more 3D. They had the suggestion of movement, but to Mondrian, this was horrifying. He didn't want his pictures to actually move. Calder did suggest that he could make a rectangle oscillate, and Mondrian was completely not for this. In Calder, though, it sparked inspiration. Okay, so he started thinking like an artist and the engineer that he was, and he thought he could try and mechanize these things. Mondrian did become his friend, though. The main difference between Mondrian and Calder is that Mondrian is primarily two-dimensional, and Calder at this point really jumps into working almost solely, except for his gouache paintings, in 3 dimensions. Again, it's this limited color palette, high contrast, abstraction, and it is emulating the form of music and of dance. All right, so this is what Alexander Calder started making after his visit to Mondrian's studio. It's all about form, it's all about simplicity, it's all about movement. He's renouncing representation, these are found objects. He is joining a group as well, the abstract creation group, and really all of these artists and the abstract movement in general are taking forms and turning them into geometric constructions. They're simple arrangements and they're painting with primary colors. Calder really loved leaving the outcome to chance and even to his audience. He would invite people to play with these objects and pendulum sweep those balls to try and make noises on the different objects. He also loved children, and to think going to a museum as a kid and being allowed to touch the art, that was pretty unheard of, and Calder was really kind of encouraging it. So this abstract creation group started in Paris in 1931, and it aimed to promote abstract art through group exhibitions. Piet Mondrian was a member, and near the end of this group, there were over 400 members. Calder, you'll see that quote there. That is part of his statement for one of the forwards to his show. All right, so we have a very famous example bicycle wheel on the right of Duchamp, Marcel Duchamp, and on the left we have one of Calder's first mechanized mobiles. It is not hanging, it is stabilized on a pedestal, on a base, but this is the sculpture that Marcel Duchamp saw in Alexander Calder's studio, and he picked it up and he liked it, and he actually is the one who came up with the name mobile. So Duchamp is concerned with ready-mades. He really raised questions about what art really could be. And critics asked whether it was art if you had to flip a switch to make it move. So they're both dealing with questions of whether it or not it is art. Not everybody agreed. But they did become friends, and extremely influential is the Armory show, which we'll learn about in a little while, that Duchamp really became the star of. He was involved in that show, also involved in the abstract creation group, as well as the Artist in Exile show. While many Americans made fun of this art, Calder really embraced Duchamp's constructions. It was less about material and all about motion for both of them. All right, so that was a quote by Fernand Léger. He was a friend of Calder's as well. He was part of the abstract creation group. He's also a futurist in some ways. Different parts of his artworks can be called that. He's really referencing, this is a quote about Calder. He's talking about how he really uses the absoluteness of shape and color, and he really plays with his materials. This is a portrait of Léger that Calder created. It is made out of wire, and it's pure plastic manipulation. Léger is talking about how it really reflects the modern era as well, the present day, because the times that these two were living in were really changing pretty rapidly, molding to new ideas, just like Calder was molding the wire. Calder has an impulse to humor and movement and shape and balance. Laguerre was a cubist, a futurist, a abstract artist, and he, in his lifetime, made a mechanical ballet that the critics called, Christopher Green called it an experiment in controlled creation of movement, using the photo image, mobile or stable, as the base unit in his series of measured rhythmic sequences. And both of these two, Calder and Laguerre, shared a mechanical interest. They had both had an engineering background. Moving on to another influence, another major influence and personal friend of Calder's was Jean Moreau. So Moreau is really concerned with biomorphic forms, and this one you can start to see some kind of creatures with teeth and eyes and undulating lines. It's referencing something in nature, but it's abstract. So it's not very literal. It's living, it's abstract, but you can reference living forms or the human body. Calder would stick to this as well in any kind of representational art that he made. He did make sculptures later on in life, but they were mostly biomorphic. Nothing after meeting Mondrian that was very realistic. All right, nothing in the realism realm. Moreau really had a childlike abandon, and he used his subconscious and unconscious mind, like Calder as well, to generate his artwork. He had a real contempt for conventional painting, which again Alexander developed as well. They are both of these artists have a similar formal style of shape, line, color, dark outlines. The composition is an all-over composition. And you see that from the quote as well, at first Calder really had his objects quite detached from one another. And this started building a cosmic relationship, a flexibility, the use of value, the use of motion as a value, like choreography in his artworks. And both of these paintings seem to really dance. And I'm sorry, the one on the right is a painting. The one on the left is actually a wool rug that Alexander Calder had made. Now, this was during a time when there was a craft movement going on in the 60s and 70s, so this wool rug was sort of a nod to his times as well. The reference to choreography also gives a nod to Calder's love of dance and a nod to some of his future projects. So Jean Arp is another influence. This is another abstract artist. This artist is also the person who came up with the name stabiles. So stabiles are in reaction to mobiles, right? And upon a meeting, Calder adopted this name and ran with it, really. He was part of the abstract creation group as well. He worked in biomorphic abstraction like Calder did, and so did Jean Moreau. He also chose a monochromatic palette. You see a lot of smooth lines, smooth contours that suggest movement and have a really organic feel that mirrors what you see in Calder's work, or really Calder's work maybe mirrors from Jean Arp's. Jean Arp also has a nod to inspiration from natural forms like clouds and stars, and he called them cosmic shapes. So this does tie into our theme later on of Calder's of subject matter of the universe. All right, moving on to our next theme, play. So as you can see, Alexander Calder is really a giant bear of a child at heart. He didn't feel like engineering was involving enough play or ingenuity. And at the Stevens Institute of Technology, he learned a lot of great engineering skills that he would use later on in life. He did graduate in 1919, and he had a really great facility for math and physics, which would work well for his sculptures later. But it was too serious for him, not enough about play. He was a lifelong tinkerer, right? And he really viewed making artwork as a design challenge. He loved kids. He said that his kids were his biggest fans. He encouraged them to touch the artworks, and they loved touching it. He was a very playful person, and he made his artwork simple enough for kids to understand. It was very animated, like his personality. And you see him being a clown here, making some different funny masks. He wanted to genuinely make people happy with his art, which is kind of why I think I was attracted to it as a child myself. And it's really hard not to like. It is such a playful, kind of positive color palette and simplicity of form that it's hard to find a lot of fault with. Now, I'm saying that from my contemporary point of view. During his time period, there were a lot of critics who didn't love what he was doing. But from the beginning, he had this playful nature, and he started making toys right from the start, making toys for his sister, making jewelry for his sister's dolls. And his circus body of work is directly related to that. So that quote really sets up the time period you're seeing talking about Mark Twain and Buster Keaton. Again, Europe viewed America a little bit differently. We, as a country, had a lot of different ideals. Buster Keaton, Mark Twain, those are entertainers. Josephine Baker here, also an entertainer. Calder did sort of present himself as an entertainer. It was part of an aspect of his personality. He really liked clowning around, and the toys that he made, the circus shows that he did himself, he even put voices in there. It was really quite an experience. He had quite a personality. This quote also mentions primitivity, and that is really referencing a school of thought that was taking representation and making it into geometric forms, very simple lines, simple angles. The design and composition was simple. It was the cubists were also kind of in this primitive vein as well. They took inspiration from the recent fad of African art, which had been being exhibited quite a bit during these times. His artwork was also compared to cave art. So this is the other primitive reference that they're talking about. Since he had such strong outlines and simple forms, they did reference this cave art painting. And it was this primitive movement was part of the vernacular, the language of the time. It, even in the description of it, there is a lot of movement. So this is very Calder-esque as well, right? It talks about looping, it talks about vibrating, about bobbing, about springing. There's a lot of dynamism in that type of language, and it hints to the futurism that Calder took inspiration from as well. On the right here, you see the personification of this quote as well, that sculpture is an aerial act. But overall, it is very cheerful. It's really refreshing. It's art without humbug. And Calder has this X-ray eye that you can kind of see with his wire sculpture here of Josephine Baker. So you see in this quote and in these pictures, Calder is really a very American artist. He does really personify that American spirit. He's exuberant, he's buoyant, he has a lot of vigor, he's working from a humoristic vitality kind of force behind him. He is this spirit is why a lot of people traveled from other countries to America for a better life, for a easier way of life. You could have more religious freedom, you could have more social freedom, you could have social classes mixing. And here you have Calder on the left, he's doing kind of a parody. He was paid by the Goulding Company to make prototypes for toys, and he's pretending to be a cowboy on the range, lassoing these bull toys he's got here. It's a reference in the quote and this picture to the frontier heritage of America, right? So it calls to mind a conquering of the West, the rough and tumble pioneer, the hard life, the rough life, but you had to be really strong to make it in that frontier life. So it's also a positive as well. This is sort of wrapped together in this romantic ideal of in American art history of a utopia with nature, harmony with Native Americans, living close to the land. But it was really hard, and you really had to make your own way with your own two hands. And this does contrast a little bit with Calder's actual life. So he's being kind of silly here, but he came from a well-off family. Both of his paternal relatives were pretty well known. He also married his wife, Louisa, who came from a lot of money. So he could live very comfortably and not have to make a ton of work, even though he did make quite a ton of work. He is operating from a point of leisure, though. He's got a lot of leisure time to be able to make all this sculpture, to be able to go to school. All right, so that quote was kind of talking about how abstraction and humor can, in combination, communicate emotions without direct representation. When you don't have direct representation, it means that you don't have distractions from the work, and the observer really is captured with their attention. These performances that Alexander Calder performed in people's houses and all over Europe, they were really animated, and he enlisted other artists to help him, like Noguchi. He helped man the Victrola on one of his performances. He would also react and respond to the audience, and it was really a immersive experience, much like in earlier American art history traditions of the panoramic and the cyclorama. It was a engrossing experience that you felt like you were, not in reality there, but feeling like you could be there. It wasn't a battle scene, though. This was the circus, not like the panorama. But it was an anti-academic setting. It was it was a very American idea, and it was in keeping with the American Art Students League of non-academia. All right, so here's an example of a kind of setup that he would have for his circus, and a detail shot of one of his favorite characters, the clown. He kind of thought of himself as a clown. You see in the quote that he really started making these toys because of his personality, but also to make money. He was living poor as an artist, right? And he started making these prototypes, and they started getting more and more realistic and developed, and they turned into this whole body of work of the circus. It satisfied his desire for planning and ingenuity, and they did move, and this was from his engineering background. And true to his humor and casual nature, these items really fit into his style. He was a born performer, he was a born showman, and again, he was always collecting these little bits of things. So he made things out of trash and scraps. He liked, like when he was a little boy, to collect things and put them in his pockets. Here you have an example of some correspondence from the Gould Manufacturing Company. This is some correspondence they had about developing a new line of toys that he was working on. Okay, so that quote was talking about these wire portraits, which are the part of his career and body of work that are more representational. There are representational portraits, and we have here animals. They came from those journalistic stylized drawings and caricatures that he made from his newspaper days, the single line picture capturing an essence of a person. It also references that he is starting to think about scale. He's thinking about scaling up a lot of these models into larger works. There's also a nod to Modigliani, and that you can see through his sculptures. So in Modigliani's work, you can kind of feel the forms and see the forms through the subject, and that is very apparent in an almost transparent material like using wire. It's this X-ray view that we mentioned earlier, and it's a nod to futurism, right? It's the cubism from Spain and the seeing multiple views at once. All right, here is a link to a video where you can actually see some of the performance, and it's really quite stunning. You can see it was so popular that even in his later life, he was still performing this circus, Cirque Calder is what they called it, for audiences. It had a really living quality in their uncertainty. You didn't know if the trapeze artist was going to make it to the swinging bar, and if it didn't, it would try it again. At first, it was really for his own amusement. Then it became really elaborate. It became a feat that he performed, a production, and it was all contained in 5 large suitcases. Things like fake guns going off, trapeze artists jumping, vaulting off of seesaws, being shot out of a cannon. These were all amazing engineering feats. Even though they were toys, they were engineering feats for him to accomplish. One of the most impressive feats was that of the butterflies. So Jean Moreau went to see some of those shows, and he really loved these little bits of paper that were attached to a wire that would kind of flutter down to a person and land on them. And it was really a quite beautiful and joyful expression in these circus works, all achieved by movement. All right. So that quote really talked about Duchamp's New Descending Staircase, and here you have it on the right. This is a poster also on the left of the Armory show. New Descending Staircase really is the epitome of motion in art, right? It's the primary element of art that the futurists are using. This is kind of a cubist view of this as well, seeing multiple perspectives at once. But Duchamp is not using representational form, right? It's a human, probably, but it's kind of hard to tell. We are given that reference from the title for sure. And instead, he's using repeated elements. He's also showing us motion lines. The composition is using motion. And Calder adopted this as well. So this is part of his process and his theory of using motion. And in Futurism, this rapid fire of repeating forms was really common. The Armory show was really a survey of modernism, and there was quite a harsh backlash against the show. People were pretty unhappy. They really thought it was grotesque. They didn't like the deformation of the human body because it was reduced to geometric forms. And they had not really been introduced to abstraction before, so it was a real break with tradition. People, especially in what we saw Teddy Roosevelt's quote or reading that we had, was talking about how it was really too academic. It wasn't for the everyday man. It was too formal. It wasn't for everyday people. It was really focused on composition, on form, and using form as a universality. They did not like it because it didn't have a lot of narrative and it didn't have a lot of figuration. And that is consistent with Calder's work as well. So we have a little more talk about futurism. This is a quote from their manifesto, and you know, Calder didn't think of himself as a futurist. They were kind of interested in war making and things like that. But what he did take away from it was that speed, that they saw speed as being beautiful. And the speed was really reflecting the new modern world. There were new technologies, there was new transportation, new ways of moving people and getting them there much faster. It also enabled travel to be easier. So people could go take these trips to Europe, right? That they couldn't do before. There was new things like the airplane, steamship, railroads, subway, ferries, automobiles. Life was really moving at a very fast pace, and it was very exciting. It had a lot of dynamism, and that's why it's reflected in the futurist artworks. And that's what Calder was attracted to with their style. There was this frenetic movement, and it was really like the flickering of the movie reels, of the movie frames flickering by. It was very modern. Art at that time was pretty static. It was pretty boring, and the abstract, the modernists really thought it was very old-fashioned, and they wanted to move into this new century. Calder always had this underlying theme of movement in his work, even in his stabiles, which are not moving. They are a scene of line, that they are like lumbering animals. And instead of the artwork moving, which is he's really known for, it makes the actual viewer have to do the movement. They have to walk around the sculpture, look under it, walk under it, and things like that. So he's done a role reversal, which is pretty interesting as well. We see her in Fishbowl with a Crank that Calder is not totally divorced from representation yet. We do see images of fish, but really the material is secondary. The real material is motion, and his ability to manipulate the formal qualities of this wire into line, into shape, into directionality, to make it really feel alive and move. And you see on the bottom right-hand corner, there is a hand crank that makes this move. The quote is referring to this interest in poetry and visual music, right? It has a visual rhythm and an actual rhythm of how it moves. In modernism, this musical structural quality, it has a pattern of movements. The forms are flattened to emphasize the abstract elements. And the wire sculptures are like variations. So he did a ton of these wire sculptures, and variations in music are taking the same idea and enacting it through different forms, different series. So it is sort of like a musical theme that he's working with. And this is this theme he'll work with the rest of his life. Just like Stieglitz did with his Cloud series of portraits. He's composing this music, quote music, with photographs and curatorial choices. So the photos are drawing a visual connection and drawing this visual musical form together. You see this in artists also like James McNeill Whistler, an abstract communication of content that is not explicit, right? Music, you feel, you aren't told, it doesn't tell you what you're supposed to feel, right? All right, here we have Black Frame. It is his version of what he thought a moving painting would look like, really. Nothing is fixed, all is in relationship to other elements in its universe. So there is a environment being created here. This is his mini universe. We'll talk about more about his universes, but it is sort of a contained environment. It is against the static, though, because static is boring, stale, old, like his dad and his grandfather's work, right? Abstract is more exciting and it has a movement of the eye. You're trying to develop relationships between different elements. It's like the internal workings of an atom. And again, we're in the atomic age, right? The atomic bomb is just a few years down the line going to be invented. There isn't representation here, so it's not necessarily meant to have meaning, but it's more about the future. The future is motion, he believes, and motion is going to be the future for sculpture. Before, it was very classical and symbolic. Ideal bodies were being formed, and it was full of references. Here you see none of that. I really love that quote. It does directly pair with Herbert Matter's photograph here. The visual imagery of an element leaving a wake of motion behind it was really kind of beautiful. This is also a reference to other technological advancements in photography, right? So before we saw Muybridge, who used stop motion photography, where he was able to freeze movements, especially we saw the horse mid gallop where it lifts all of its feet off the ground. That was only possible through photography. So that's something to be interesting. An interesting note. You also see here in this, you see a blur. And a blur is a device to show that different movement. It conveys a message of motion. You see here in the photograph that there are enough differentiation of repeated forms that we also can imply this futurism, this rapid fire repetition of forms. Herbert Matter is a friend of Calder's, and he photographed and filmed Calder many times. Calder's engineering background is really responding to this mechanical eye as well, the photograph. His knowledge of inertia and mass is really helpful in his sculptures and being able to capture them and the feeling they have of this movement. This really does, you see in this quote a gentler side of Calder. We see him a lot of times as a boisterous kind of guy who's joking around, but this quote really references a delicate hand when it comes to a sculpture, and that's an interesting contrast. All right, we see here Martha Graham. Martha Graham becomes really all right, here we see Martha Graham. During this time, she really becomes an artistic force in the 20th century. She's a friend of Calder, and she asked him to help. Her approach is to dance and theater, and it really revolutionized the form. She's quite innovative in her asking of Calder, but also in her dance moves and her form. So she asked him to make a sculpture for her, The Glory Folk. This is her production. And it really, this quote and the sculpture is really talking about how it transforms the space. It becomes a stage and gives it a dramatic context. The sculpture really becomes an actor here. It's an agent of movement, and it performs for the stage. It takes on aspects of the human body, which are not mechanical. It has a life of its own. So someone's not in the background cranking that mobile. It is moving by sheer movement of air from dancers' bodies, right? It really does inhabit the space. And this is really a new idea. This is kind of a revolutionary way of thinking about dance and theater. It didn't have a motor, so it could take on its own life. It took on human characteristics, and the artist was not in control. And Alexander really liked this about some of his mobiles, that he did not have control over over how they would move through space. And you see a photograph on the right. He really himself was a fan of movement. Those are two quotes talking about this production work in progress. So this was done for the Teatro dell'Opera in Italy. You can click on the link below the larger image to see a video clip of that. But it's talking about how this was a production, an abstract production. There was no really plot or representation. There were no words, there was no narrative, there was no song, very an abstract movement and modernism way of thinking. It was talking about how it stands for the infinite mystery of the universe, again with the universe with Calder. It mirrors the modern world because the modern world is yearning for peace and freedom. This is, again, a time in the 60s when there was a turmoil of war. We'd had Korea, we have Vietnam, and although Alexander Calder is not an overtly political artist, there are some critics and art historians who have interpreted some of these yearnings, specifically in this piece, to have symbolized some of his anti-war sentiments. The stage is really becoming the action, and it is becoming the actor itself, even though it's an abstract one. Okay, this was an interesting artifact I found, a source material. This is a medallion on the left that Alexander Calder's father, Alexander Sterling Calder, had created. It was for the Society of Medalists, and this was sort of an arts organization that gave out awards, and it's talking about the dance of life, right? So it's talking about these cosmic rhythms that compel people to do things. It's a philosophy of life, making yourself balanced. It's sort of like a reference to Alexander Calder's mobiles, how gravity and wind were these unseen cosmic forces directing the movement as well. They're talking, the medallion talking about balance, and in the mobile there is actual physical balance, right? So you move in an abstract dance on their own. They carve out space and pattern around them. Benton is talking about these rhythms, and they look very similar to his diagrams of the compound and alternating elements in his essay on the mechanics of organizing form and painting. And it's talking about how you arrange these elements to achieve movement and rhythm in art. He's talking about how it's lateral versus vertical progression and extension, and you see here that there is lateral and vertical progressive extension in Calder's mobile. So it's a little bit changing that idea. Thomas Hart Benton, again, hated abstract art. He was really a 2D guy, and he was trying to talk about this arrangement of how it would go across in friezes and murals. Calder's really talking about in this mobile about 3D space. So it's real space, it's literal space, it's lateral as well as vertical extension, but both of them were, again, concerned with the formal elements and structure. That was a really great quote about how Calder did give into nature and let nature take control. Gravity, the atmosphere, air currents were really in control of how these mobiles moved in museum settings and outdoors. There was a beautiful, infinitesimal possibility of variations, right? So just like the infiniteness of the universe, there were an infinite number of ways this mobile could move in space. It was self-propelled, spontaneous, natural, and having freedom. This is also a very American idea, a very American thing to do, not knowing the outcome, right? It's the antithesis of the tradition in American art, which is genteel, to be in control of the body, right? We see all kinds of things like Washington having to be in complete control of his teeth because it would show symbolically weakness of the Union if he was portrayed in a painting or on stage giving a speech to not be in control of his body. Alexander is giving into this lack of control. So it's an antithesis of this, right? It is also when you have this uncontrollableness of your body, it has these political overtones, right? It's an anti-frontier ordeal because you cannot have control over nature. It's a symbolic representation of that. Now we see it moving. All right, finally we have Flamingo, one of my favorite sculptures. I visited many times when I was in Chicago. And any really discussion about movement in Calder's work also has to talk about the artworks that do not move, okay? So you must include stabiles, the opposite. George Salas, the director of National Museums of France, talked about this oppositional nature, how one moves and one is static. Quote, one could say the stabile is a mobile in repose, and a mobile is a stabile in motion, end quote. So there's this duality. Think about that duality of the two sides of the coin that Alexander Calder's father was looking at. That's his dad's medallion. Birth, pain, plus pleasure. Those are the two sides of kind of life, the duality of life. There's also duality in the symmetry, right? Symmetry versus asymmetry. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but Thomas Hart Benton promotes this idea as well, that asymmetry is really more dynamic, right? So if we're talking about dynamic versus stable, the stable would be here where you're moving around it. It's too perfect. It's not too perfect because it's asymmetrical, but a piece of artwork that doesn't move, that doesn't have asymmetry, is too stable, too perfect. Something like this that does have asymmetry, it is dynamic, it has movement, it's different on either half. It's still balanced though, right? This is not going to fall over. This duality as well of the viewer. So the viewer in a stable work of art, like a regular painting, just stands in front of this painting, right, and looks at it, right? But in a sculpture like this, you have to move around it. So it's creating a different duality of role of the viewer. These stables really do become monumental. They become iconic of Calder. People love to walk under them. There's even a town where he has a sculpture even bigger than this where buses have to drive underneath it, and Calder just loves that idea. All right, here we have a first mention of really primitive art. This was a really popular term during Calder's lifetime and throughout modernism. This is referring to the love of streamlined, simplified art, which was inspired by African art. And on the right, you can really see in this untitled piece a reference to figural forms, but figural forms that might appear on caves or on pots, maybe even taking some directly body shapes from African artifacts, right? Alain Locke is talking about primitive art as a controlled, disciplined, abstract mastery of material. It has a simplicity of conception, design, and effect. This is how he characterized African art. And this primitive aspect of it is finding its way into Alexander Calder's work as well, right? So this is, in comparison, and opposite to the decadent art of the time. European art was becoming very sterile, and it was kind of really over-imitating the Greeks. This is really similar to the thought and concept process of Alexander Calder's work. It doesn't look exactly the same as African art, but is still very geometric, very abstract. It has a limited color palette. It's looking at notan again, those relationships of dark and light. It is the same kinds of aspects that the Cubists were really interested in as well. They were fascinated by flattening that form. Same as Alexander Calder, flattening the space, although in Cubism it was looking at multiple perspectives and really sticking to this geometric form, but both were kind of fracturing the picture plane. So here's a stabile. It's a combination of mobile and stabile. It's a composite that Alexander has here, little spider. This quote here is really talking about how abstract art is expecting the viewer to bring emotions and experiences with them. So this is as opposed to formalistic realism painting, which was using different symbols, hand gestures, body posture, qualities of fabric, showing wealth by how many different pieces of fruit or plants that you had in your painting. This is different. This is really working on people's innate emotions, right? So its representation is before it was telling the viewer what to think, and it was not taking into account preconceived notions. Quote, flat objects that move, end quote. So this is talking about how it's not limited to free interpretation. It can be just open for free interpretation and pure enjoyment. It is like music in that respect as well, which we mentioned earlier, that it doesn't contain one emotion or message. All right, so Calder and Benton are really talking about just the essentials, right? And here's a perfect example, an ink on paper drawing that Calder has done of Sartre and of Jean-Paul Sartre. It is arguing that the elimination of everything else makes it stronger art. It makes it more impactful, more memorable. It recalls primitivism and modernism as well as abstract art, all qualities true for all of these movements: color, shape, form, mass, line, movement, balance. These are all elements of art. These are all principles of art. And this is the main focus. Again, we're talking about the formal elements of Calder's work, but they really comprise most of his work. It's this power of composition. You see references here to dark and light as well. So Wesley Dow and his themes of notan. James McNeill Whistler. Benton is mentioned as a quote, the person in the quote, but also he talks about the relationships of dark and light. And when you have just dark and light, it really accentuates everything. This ink drawing is just black and white. It's simple, but it's still full of movement. My eye really travels around those spirals and up the smoke that is in writing. It is very apparent, this movement, because there are no distractions. And you see on the right, this drawing was used for a book cover. Here we see Alexander Calder referencing that his love of fauvism, so his love of color to express emotion. But color for him, he talked about in this quote, was really secondary. It was really used to just differentiate objects. It was more for contrast, because black and white was really the most important to him. Again, that theory of notan, that light and dark harmony. But without distractions of color and texture and fine detail, he does like color. He does use it, and he's using it to his benefit. This is something you could definitely spot in the sky, right? There is a light balancing the dark here, a color versus the absence of color as well. The no-tan idea has been taken into the 3D form. It's been modernized, if you will, but it still feels flat. These colors, these shapes don't have shading to make them appear 3D, really. It does have a very graphic quality, and this is something that you see in abstract art as well. It's still non-representational. I can't pick out what any of those squiggles are supposed to be, but it has the graphic qualityness that is very modern. It has a clean edge. It looks reproducible, and it has been flat. It's flat in the form. Even though this is a plane, it does feel quite flat. This was done in Alexander Calder's later life as well. All right, so here we have an untitled piece. It's an ink and gouache on paper. He did primarily use gouache throughout his career. It was a medium that he liked quite a lot. And his quote here, again, is about color, about black and white, but it's all about shape and it's all about form. The no-tan is talked about in terms of using black and white, a limited color palette. That's so that you don't distract from the clarity of the composition, because it's all about composition, and that color does communicate. So gouache is something that he is not known as much for, though he did it throughout his career constantly. He got up early every day to paint, and sculpture was really what he did in the afternoons. But it is he did primarily work in three-dimensional mediums, but this is something that he did in two-dimensional. Okay, there we have quite a bit of a talk about the formal aspects of symmetry and rhythm and balance. So we're talking about symmetry in combination with order. That does not make a composition. Alexander Calder's really working with these accidents. And this is something that Thomas Hart Benton maybe would not have enjoyed, this discussion of accidents, but Calder really did embrace his playing with materials and finding these happy accidents, like happy little trees, right? Okay, so Benton is talking about the mechanics of rhythm, how you can repeat a form, so we have repeated forms of spheres here, to make a dynamic sequence. And you can see this very clearly in the mobiles. Here it is with shape, right? We're also talking about asymmetrical balance. You get more dynamic of a feeling. It's more interesting because there's this constant shifting back and forth of weights to prevent it from toppling. And it's finding that asymmetrical balance that Calder really was working for. This inequality of balance also keeps us looking around the composition as well. All right. We had a quote there which characterized the other really major event or awakening of Alexander Calder's life. This is when he was he was at sea. He was getting paid to paint the ship, to paint it, to camouflage it and things like that. And he woke up from a nap on the deck, being able to see both the sun rising and the moon still in the sky. And because of the curvature of the earth and his position at sea, he could see them both at the same time. And this was really a moving moment for him and became really the source of inspiration for a lot of his artworks in the following years of his life and his career. It was very important to him. So he really did at this point feel the monumentalness and the power of the universe. He could see this because he was in a unique situation, right? He didn't have anything blocking his view. We don't have these moments every day because we have mountains in the way, we have skylines in the way, and at sea he was really getting to see the earth and nature and the universe at its most clearest. So there's a question here too: does this object exist outside of movement? And it's really a question of reality as well. Calder's really catching movements and fashioning them. And this is a time when we're questioning reality as well, right? There's a lot of things coming up in science and philosophy that are questioning the nature of being. And it's very natural that his artwork is sort of taking this philosophical and worldview approach. All right, so we saw those quotes there about how even at an early age, Alexander Calder really did have this fascination with the universe. He, as a child, was very popular in that time period as well, read a lot of books about astronomy and the constellations. He would have gone to museums and seen this contraption here on the right that was the really earliest representations of the known universe and constellations. The quote is also talking about how, the other quote is talking about how he makes art of these times, right? So that article from Life was done in 1968. That's the year before the moon landing and the space craze, in the height of the space craze. The next year, America won that space race, right? An American achievement. It was a very American victory. And this fascination with the universe happened before this craze for the space race, but it was still in the vernacular and it was still really important. And I think that's why a lot of people identified with it as well. It is also a really abstract way of thinking. This quote references, his mom is like, well, you don't know anything about the universe. And Calder's like, well, do I really need to know a lot to still have an idea about it? And that's a really abstract thought to, not have all this representation, all of this research, have it to be exactly the verisimilitude of how it looks exactly in nature. That's not interesting or important to abstract artists. They have an idea, they're trying to convey it through these formal compositions, and that's what he's talking about. And here we see this sculpture animated. Again, we have a talking about the American vernacular and what's in the vernacular. We have a lot of scientific frontiers being broken, engineering and mechanic frontiers, and space. So here are two news clippings. One on the left is of the discovery of Pluto, which is pretty exciting to everybody at the time. And on the right, we have a discussion of Einstein and his theories of relativity, gravitation, and the unified field. Einstein would also then go on to develop the atom bomb, right? Or at least the ideas behind the atom bomb. So this is a different frontier. It's a frontier of thought. It's taking time, relativity, and space and questioning it. It's about an expanding universe. This was a national fascination of the time. So just like we were talking about before, he is an artist of his times. He makes work of his times. This was similar to the American frontier, this fascination, right? And back in those days, people on the East Coast would be at their desk job being bored, and they would drool over stories of the frontiersmen and the adventures and all of those types of people. It also had a lot to do with masculinity and affirming masculinity. Again, the American issue, always threatening this masculinity that they're always having to reassert it, right? It was symbolized more in the West in countless paintings and being depicted from a movement of the right side of the painting to the left, this symbolic moving out of the west, moving towards that side of the work. Einstein did know about Calder's work as well. He saw a show of his in Europe, and there's an anecdote about him spending 45 minutes standing under the sculpture to see the full revolutions of the sculpture, and having been quoted as saying, "Boy, I wish I would have thought of that." Pretty interesting. So there's a direct connection with him and Einstein. All right, so here we have the planet. This is an ink on paper drawing. This is similar to a lot of the formal aspects of his work. We see no tan, we see dark and light relationships. We see a lot of formal relationships that create movement. I see undulating lines. I see a sketchiness quality of the line near the bottom. I see a leading line that my eye is supposed to follow, right? And then I have these forms that I move around, these spheres. And this quote is talking about how art is really realized. It's not, it's really a spoken like an engineer, a boiling down of the universe into mass, light, speed, and forces. His sculptures can be boiled down to these same forces as well, right? His technical mind is showing this here. He has this mechanical background, and it's reflected in the motorized paintings and sculptures and mobiles. It's also a very toneless image, right? There's a relationship here of black and white. There is no narrative. The composition is key. There is a lot of dark and light, and that is all there is, and it's shape and relationships of space. It also has a nod to the futurism, that speed, that I can really see your eye really whipping around the side of that sphere there. It's communicated through the formal devices of line, shape, and repetition here. This is a really interesting quote because in Calder's later life, he really does not and has no interest in explaining his work. So him saying that a sphere stands for the earth and it means more than what it is, just a shape, is really something quite remarkable. He's explaining more than he normally submits. And later on, he'll even joke with reporters and turn their questions into jokes or just even ignore them. So this is kind of interesting. This is the only time that you're really going to see him talking about symbolism of his work, of these shapes and of these colors. So he's inferring that his sculptures are dull without knowing what it is behind it. And I'm not sure that he totally agrees with this later on, but here he's saying that it is important that you know that this is the universe, right? It makes it really come more alive because there's some kind of a sense behind it. It's emanating from these shapes once you know that there is some kind of relationship with the universe. And so here there is a nod to representation, but it's in a very abstract way of doing it. Okay, and lastly, we have here a talk about working from a live model. Now, this is not the same live nude models that the Art Students League was talking about. He's using the universe as the model, right? He points to the really formal basis of everything, that everything is mass, form, and movement. He can really boil down all subject matter and all of his art down to one or two subjects, and one of them being the universe, right? The other being probably play. Just like modernism, where form is used as a universal language of communication and subject matter, so too is the universe here, because we all have a relationship to it. And in some way or another, we can all connect and understand what we're talking about when we say the universe. Oh, I see our museum director over there. Well, thank you all so much for coming out. It's been a real treat. I hope you learned something about Alexander Calder in the context of his work. Wasn't it pretty great how he could fit his flamingo sculpture in here? Well, are there any questions? Thanks again for choosing the Solomon Guggenheim Museum. We look forward to seeing you again. Now please make your way towards the illuminated exit signs. As you leave, consider visiting our gift shop to commemorate your visit with us. We appreciate your feedback and comments to enhance future museum experiences. Y'all come back now here.